Once again, welcome. I'm Dane Borges, Director of the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Chicago. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to this symposium on U.S.-Cuban academic relations, May 4th, 2007. I'm going to introduce our speakers for the first half of the afternoon, and the second half of the afternoon is a panel discussion. And before I introduce our speakers, I would like to tell you of two upcoming events. For one of them, actually, I'm not certain of the particulars. And that is that we will have a workshop here at the Center for Latin American Studies on Wednesday, May 9th, that is next week. And I've been given two times for it. One is at 2 in the afternoon and the other is at 4 in the afternoon. Which is correct? 4. So from 4 to 5 in the afternoon on Wednesday, May 9th, we'll have a practical workshop on how to apply for research travel to Cuba using the University of Chicago Cuba license. That's for faculty and graduate students of the University of Chicago to conduct research in Cuba. So I know many of you actually are people who have researched in Cuba or are planning to and have burning questions about that. But you might want to save the Cuba license questions for our workshop next week. The second event that I'd like to announce, another upcoming event, is the week after next. On Tuesday, May 15th, we'll show the new documentary Dream Havana, directed by Gary Marks, in Stewart Hall 102, that's in the building next to this one, at 4:30 p.m. I think the film is 80 minutes long, is that correct, Gary?
It's 81.
81 minutes long. It's a screening that begins at 4:30 p.m. and then it will be followed by a discussion with the director Gary Marks, who is with us in the audience today. It's a film filmed on location in Cuba, the United States, and Mexico on the friendship between two Cuban writers, one of whom left Cuba in 1994 and lives in the United States, in Chicago actually, and the other who remains in Cuba. So. As is the custom at the University of Chicago, we always have questions at all events, including lectures by dignitaries who aren't used to answering questions. Our two speakers this afternoon are, of course, great interlocutors of academia. But I would ask you to wait for the questions, which will follow the talk, and I'll moderate the questions and answers then. I'd like to introduce both of our speakers now. They've probably been on how many panels together? Dozens? This might be the 100th panel they've shared. They're two of the most distinguished United States students of Cuban, of U.S.-Cuban relations. Wayne Smith, who will speak first, is Senior Fellow at the Center for International Policy in Washington, D.C. He directs that institution's Cuba program. Mr. Smith is also Adjunct Professor of Latin American Studies at Johns Hopkins University, where he's promoted academic exchanges with Cuba. Mr. Smith was educated in Latin America. In 1990, he received the Henry L. Kane Most Distinguished Alumnus Award from La Universidad de las Américas in Puebla, his undergraduate institution. And he was also educated in the United States. He took MAs at Columbia University and a doctorate at George Washington University. He had a long and distinguished foreign service career in the State Department, beginning just at the cusp of the Alliance for Progress and continuing through his resignation from the post of Chief of Mission at the U.S. Interest Section in Havana, Cuba in 1982. After retiring from the State Department, he continues to influence U.S. policy, first as a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and now at the Center for International Policy. Wayne Smith has published books on the Falklands War and on Soviet policy in Latin America, but his abiding interest, I think, and his greatest influence in the U.S. public sphere has been in the issue of U.S.-Cuban relations. His analytical memoir of Cuba, The Closest of Enemies, a personal and diplomatic account of the Castro years, published in 1987, is an important document of U.S.-Cuban relations. Our second speaker will be Lou Paris. Louis Paris Jr. is J. Carlisle Citizen Professor of History at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and he's editor of the journal Cuban Studies Estudios Cubanos. He's a graduate of Pace College of the University of Arizona and took his doctorate at the University of New Mexico. Lou Paris is certainly the most prolific and authoritative historian of Cuban history and of U.S.-Cuban relations in the United States. Among his 18 books are, I said prolific, among his 18 books are what I would consider the best single-volume history of Cuba in English, Cuba Between Reform and Revolution, which I think is in its 3rd edition with Oxford Press. Many works on the Spanish-American War and on 20th century Cuban political history, and most recently, a series of path-breaking monographs on the cultural history of Cubans. On Becoming Cuban, published in 1999, is a history of Cubans' dialogues with American influences and with American models. He's also published a book on hurricanes and a book on suicide, To Die in Cuba, Suicide and Society. And his work in progress is what I assume is a counterpart to On Becoming Cuban. Its title is Cuba in the American Imagination, Metaphor in the Imperial Ethos. And so, like some of our colleagues here, such as Marisa Tenorio at the University of Chicago, Lou Paris has been instrumental in understanding the mutual constitution of Latin American and United States identities. Mr. Perez has received awards and fellowships, including the Guggenheim, Ford Foundation, and MacArthur Foundation the support for his research. And he's also a leader in initiatives to study and promote scholarly relations with Cuba, serving on commissions and committees such as the Latin American Studies Association Task Force on Cuba, the Cuba Committee of the American Council of Learned Societies and Social Science Research Council, and recently he's been one of the authors of Retreat from Reason, U.S.-Cuban Academic Relations in the Bush Administration, a 2006 report of the Latin America Working Group Education Fund. That report, I believe, was funded, supported by both Cuban and United States institutions, including the Ford Foundation. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our panelists, and I'll try to unobtrusively keep time. They've got about half an hour apiece. If you want to take that much time, I'll ask you to speak first, Wayne, and then Lou, and then at 4:45 we'll start with questions and answers. We'll go with questions for about 45 minutes. Take a break at 5:15, and then at 5:30 a panel discussion will begin, including a number of faculty of the University of Chicago who have done research in Cuba or are interested in U.S. scholarly relations. So once again, I'll moderate questions, and I hope to have discussion after the talks.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. The title I saw originally was Cultural Exchanges, U.S.-Cuban Cultural Exchanges. So far as I know, there aren't any. At this point, there have been. There's still some academic exchanges, but even those are down to a bare few. You know, as we opened to Cuba in 1977 under President Carter, Carter actually lifted all travel controls. Americans for a time, including academics and everyone, were free to travel to Cuba anytime they wished. That, of course, was closed down by the Reagan administration, and academic exchanges, which were going forward under Carter, were cut back, but not altogether stymied. I sort of got into the academic exchanges as chief of the U.S. intersection. Johns Hopkins, or I should say the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, brought down their first group of students in 1979, just after I had taken over as chief of the intersection. I had them out to the residents to give them a talk on where we stood at that point with U.S.-Cuban relations. And at that point in 1979, we seemed to be doing reasonably well. There's certainly no reason to think that academic exchanges would be cut off. I did leave the Foreign Service in 1982, but I left, well, I suppose you could say I left in a huff. The Reagan administration had come in, and election night, I did consider sending in my cable, asking to be withdrawn from the post, and given a job unrelated to policy until such time as I can take early retirement. But my wife said, after all, you don't know what the administration will do. They have put forward some tough rhetoric. They've given the impression that they have no interest in improving relations with Cuba. But you don't know. Wait. They know what your position is. If they don't want you to remain as the chief of the intercession, they will remove you. And after all, if they leave you, perhaps that means that despite all the rhetoric, there is some interest in a dialogue with Cuba. Not good advice, and I usually take my wife's advice. And so I decided to remain. But over a year later, I had seen one too many misrepresentations and outright lies on the part of the Reagan administration. And I really didn't want to be a part of that anymore. And so I sent in my cable asking what I thought of doing on election night, asking to be removed from the post because of my profound disagreements with policy, removed from the post and given a job unrelated to policy of any kind until such time as I can take early retirement in a few months away. To my surprise, I received a reply. Had I received that cable from the chief of mission, I would have said, yes, pack your bags and be out in 48 hours. But I received a reply saying, well, they were sorry I felt that way, but the fact was they didn't have anyone to send in to replace me. And therefore, they wondered if I could stay around a few more weeks until such time as they had someone ready. I felt, well, I made my point. I'd be willing to stay on a while, and I said a while, but not indefinitely, and then did come back and left the Foreign Service in summer of 1982, vowing that I would not really retire that sailboat and start around the world until there were normal relations between Cuba and the United States. Well, 25 years ago, and I think relations are worse now than they have ever been. Hopefully, the Democratic Congress will take some of the pain out of that. But there isn't going to be any real improvement in relations, I think, so long as this administration is in office. In any event, I left the Foreign Service, came back, and turned to professoring, as was said. I spent 2 years at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, but I started teaching at the School of Advanced International Studies at that point. And still at Johns Hopkins, I would add as a footnote that I left the School of Advanced International Studies when Paul Wolfowitz took over as the dean. He expressed some discomfort with having the Cuba program there, and I had already talked to the faculty, or already talked to the authorities, I should say, up at the Baltimore campus, and they were ready to take the Cuba studies program up there. And so on his expression of discomfort, I sent back word that not to worry, I was moving the program to Baltimore, and did. And to my pleasure and astonishment, the Ford Foundation actually raised our grant upon hearing that we were leaving science. But I've been at Johns Hopkins, either science or on the Baltimore campus ever since. It's almost 24 years. And we, until last year, until 2007, we were able to maintain an academic exchange with Cuba. even under the Reagan administration, we were able to take students down, even to bring some Cuban students up to the United States. And certainly under the Clinton administration, despite some complaints on my part as to the position of the administration on Cuba, they did not really interfere with academic and even cultural exchanges. So I would say that academic exchanges, Cubans able to come up to the United States, American students able to go to Cuba in groups to study for various periods of time. And the government didn't interfere really with how long you remain. That continued under the Clinton administration, as it should have, because after all, open academic exchanges, an exchange of views between scholars in the two countries, I think is one of the key ways in bringing about better understanding, better comprehension of one another's positions in various fields. And good heavens, having exchanges in fields of medicine, science, Cuba is very advanced in many areas of medicine. We can learn a lot from them. Cutting back on these exchanges is utterly counterproductive, harmful to our own country. But as we know, that has happened. The restrictions put forward in 2007 were, to my mind, utterly unjustified. They have no legal basis whatever. As you know, essentially they say courses must be of no less than 10 weeks duration. Well, we usually took 15 to 20 students from Johns Hopkins to Cuba for a 3-week period in January to study some aspect of Cuban history, society, politics, and so forth. We were very fortunate in 1998 that we took them down in January during the Pope's visit. And so, of course, the subject studied that year was religion in Cuba. But the courses were very popular, and they fit neatly between semesters. They didn't interfere with graduation. Now, courses must be of no less than 10 weeks duration. Another restriction is that I think this one is aimed directly at me, that only full-time permanent members of the faculty can teach these courses. Well, I've been in science for 24 years, but I'm an adjunct professor because I also do other things, and I am not interested in being a full-time member of the faculty. So I'm ruled out. I'm the director of the Cuban Exchange Program at Hopkins, but I did not teach courses in Cuba anymore. Even if we could organize them somehow, so that, and let me add, I know there are some colleges and universities that have organized summer programs, 10-week programs in the summer, so that wouldn't necessarily interfere with graduation either. But our students were not interested in that. They did not want to spend the school year and then spend another semester in effect, the summer semester, in Cuba. Some have done it. I've heard varying opinions or reactions on the matter. Some think it's working well, others think it is not. But that's beside the point. We did not want to have 10-week programs, and so for all practical purposes, we had to put the brakes to, or put our Cuba exchange program on hold. The 10 weeks, permanent members of the faculty, and only degree candidates at your college or university could take the courses. Now this goes against common practice, what had been common practice, allowing students from other colleges to take the courses, to go with you, take the course and get credit for the course. It's a way of having, of doing it less expensively and being able to include more students. Not every college and university can afford to have a Cuba program. Okay, if you don't have one, your students are interested in going to Cuba, they can go with the programs from some other school. I remember many years ago going to Paris with Temple University. I never set foot on the campus of Temple University, but I did get credit for the courses that I took. And that's the way it should be. Well, you can't do that. Have to be degree candidates. So these restrictions violate the definition of academic freedoms as set forward by the Supreme Court in a series of cases, that it is up to the academic institution to determine and decide, without any interference from the government, to decide which courses will be taught, who will teach those courses, who can take those courses, and how they will be taught. So these restrictions on the Cuban programs interfere, violate all of those freedoms as defined by the Supreme Court. And so we got together an organization called ECDET, nice sounding initials, the Emergency Coalition for the Defense of Educational Travel. We have some 450 members from all over the United States. Some of you, I think, are members of ECDET. And we file suit against the federal government for violations of academic freedoms and on a series of other grounds. And the case is now in full swing. We have just presented our brief responding to the government's suggestion, or the government's insistence, I should say, the government's insistence that the whole case, the whole thing, be dismissed, that there were no grounds for this at all. Well, of course, there are grounds. And the government's case, I must say, reading it over carefully, is pathetic. It will depend. I mean, I think our brief, I didn't write it, but our lawyer, Bob Hughes, wrote it. I think it's a brilliant piece of work. The government's case so far is pathetic, but that doesn't necessarily mean we'll win. It all depends on the federal judge and how he views things, and I suppose, what side of the bed he gets up on in the morning. But it's going forward, and we will have the government response here within the next 2 months, their response to us. And my understanding is that we then will likely actually go into court. I'm a plaintiff. ECDET is the principal plaintiff in the suit, the whole organization. Let me add, rather sad, we couldn't find a single college or university prepared to sign on as a plaintiff in the lawsuit. Not even my own, not Hopkins. They wouldn't sign on. Well, not too surprising, Hopkins gets more federal money than any other college or university in the United States. And there's some fear of offending the government and losing money. Hang on to the money and not stand on principle. Too bad, but there it is. But ECDET is a plaintiff. I am a plaintiff in the suit. There are Professor John Cotton from Howard University and two stalwart students from Johns Hopkins University who will make very good witnesses. I hope they get them on the stand. And we will go forward with this. I think this is something that simply must be done. It's a violation of our academic freedoms, but it goes against everything that we are supposed to stand for. And as you look at the government's case, it's quite clear that they really didn't have grounds for this. I mean, what they say in their brief, they say that they must do this because the abuses were leading to undermining the embargo and so forth. The flagrant abuses. And what abuses? Not a single license was canceled. No one was challenged. No one was, not even in the process of being brought to court. I don't know of a single person or a single institution that received a letter from the government saying you were in violation of the license that you have been granted. Nothing. They just say the flagrant abuses and don't present any abuses to the court. And it goes on that way. The government is nearly as I can see, at least so far, we'll see what they come up with in response to us, but so far they have not presented any real evidence at all that would cause a judge who was objective, let's say, an objective observer to say, yes, I can understand that this needed to be done. No, not at all. For the moment, let's leave the court case aside. If any of you are not members of ECDET and you would like to become, so that you at least are associated as a plaintiff, since you're a member of ECDET, you can do so simply by writing or emailing, I should say. No one writes anymore. I think postmen only deliver junk mail today, magazines, sales magazines and so on. I don't think they deliver any real mail. Maybe so. Anyway, send an email to Cuba Intern, all one word, Cuba Intern, at citonline.org, and she'll tell you what you need to do to sign up. It's really just a matter of giving your address, information, where your school you're associated with, and so forth. I'd be interested in hearing what the panelists have to say this afternoon, and hear what Lou has to say about exchanges. As I say, there are very few, so far as I know, very few academic exchanges still going. But that doesn't mean that academics can't get to Cuba. There is something called the General License for Research. And if you are a graduate student or an academic, you're a professor, with the faculty. But let me emphasize on graduate students also. And you wish to go to Cuba to do some research project, you can do so. There's a general license. You write it up. You don't have to send it to the Treasury Department to get approval, and you can travel with that. So far as I know, there are no cultural exchanges at all, which is a shame. I mean, we did have some wonderful musical groups coming up from Cuba, and a number of American writers, actors, dance troupes, and so forth were able to go to Cuba as well. And I think that's extremely important. I don't think anyone can really understand Cuba without having some sense of the music and the rest of the culture. The rest of the culture. To cut that off is almost criminal. But that shouldn't surprise anyone, I suppose. We are considering getting away from the lawsuit and back to the same issue. We are considering going to the Congress. We now have, as we all know, a Democratic Congress. There is a bill put forward by the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Charlie Rango of New York, and Jeff Flake of Arizona, to lift all travel controls. Frankly, I don't think that's going to go through. They have, I think, 106 sponsors, co-sponsors now. But even at that, I don't think the bill will be approved. Maybe next year, but not this. And there's another bill that Charlie Rango has to lift embargo altogether against Cuba. And various others. So while I frankly don't have much of a sense that these are going anywhere, we are thinking of putting forward a bill to remove all restrictions on academic travel. Yes, Charlie Rango has the big bill to remove restrictions on all travel, but again, I don't think that's going to fly. There is a more restricted effort put forward by Bill Delahunt, Massachusetts, to remove restrictions on the travel of Cuban Americans. That bill, I think, actually has a much better chance of being approved, because the restrictions on Cuban American travel are really inhumane. It used to be that Cuban Americans could visit their families in Cuba once a year, but there was no license. There was no specific license. So actually, if you wanted to visit more often than that, really no reason that you could not. Now, it's once every 3 years, and you must get a specific license. You must apply to the Treasury Department, have a license in order to travel. And there is no emergency provision. If Maria goes down to visit her mother in July, and she comes back and then hears in October that her mother is dying, there's no way that she can go down and be by her mother's bedside. She'll be told, no, you can go and visit her grave in 3 years. What does that accomplish in terms of our national interests, in terms of national security, the economy, anything? What does it accomplish? Nothing. It's simply vindictive. And many people feel that way. Many of the congressmen feel that way. So that bill might get through. We'll see how things go this year, and then come to some decision next year as to whether we should try, whether it's worthwhile, not only this effort in the court, but to try through Congress to remove restrictions on academic travel. That's assuming that Randall's bill to lift all travel controls doesn't go through. If that goes through, then we're golden. We can travel anytime we want, and for academic purposes, see circuses or anything else. But I'm not, again, I'm not optimistic that it will go forward. But let me just end by saying that this, of course, has had, I would say, a discouraging effect on our Cuba exchange program at Hopkins. We have a number of courses on Cuba, and those are still well attended. But the research effort, so there are a number of people who are doing research projects on Cuba. The number of those has now dropped dramatically. Can't go down. So, I mean, if you're a graduate student, yes, you can go on the general license, but if you're not a graduate student doing a research project, you can't go. And so you can't do research in Cuba. And if not, then the whole project loses some of its appeal and luster. So it had a deleterious effect there as well. I'm going to end there and turn the floor over to you. Let me just add that I would add Cuba between empires. I used to, some years back, when I was talking to people about Cuba and what they should read, and they could only read one book, read Cuba Between Empires, because it explains this conflict between Cuba and the United States. What is it? What is it about Cuba that so bothers the United States? And what is it about the United States, of course, that so concerns Cuba? My first op-ed in the New York Times after I left the Foreign Service, I said that Cuba seems to have the same effect on American administrations that the full moon once had on werewolves. And that's absolutely true. We simply cannot deal rationally with Cuba. And Lou's book, Between Empires, I think, and now several of the later books, help to explain that better than anything else that I've read. And so it's with great pleasure that I turn the floor over to Lou.
Thank you, William. That implicates me buying a beer maybe 10% because I get royalty. I want to start with an extract of a memorandum of understanding to which I was party in signing. It's not a matter of public record, but I don't think it's classified either. And it's a memorandum of understanding between the Cuban Academy of Sciences and the Social Science Research Council, American Council for Women's Society, signed not too long ago. And I use this as a way to start to underscore where we have been. So if you bear with me while I read these extracts, you get a sense of where we're coming from now. One, support scientific infrastructure in Cuba and increase access of scholars and scientists of Cuba to research centers and educational institutions outside of Cuba. With the purpose of facilitating the free flow of information, ideas, and people between Cuba and North America. The second will include increasing travel of intellectuals, academics, professionals between Cuba and North America. Toward this end, the SSSRC, ACLS, Cuba Working Group is committed to making good faith efforts to secure visas for Cuban scholars engaged in professional travel to the United States and facilitate bilateral exchanges between U.S. academic institutions and their Cuban counterparts. The Academy of Sciences will similarly undertake efforts to facilitate the issuance of exit visas for Cuban scholars and researchers invited to participate in programs and conferences abroad. 2. Supporting libraries, museums, archives, and other depositories of scholarly and scientific information in Cuba. This will include consideration of the following. A. Cuba and/or North American jointly sponsored initiatives to preserve, catalog, and/or to transfer into more accessible formats, microfilm and microfiche, documents, photographs, specimens, and other primary materials necessary for the conduct of scholarly and scientific research related to Cuba. B. Enriching collections of archives, libraries, and museums, facilitating access to print and electronic information, providing materials for conservation, microfilm and important historical documents, and supporting exchanges of archivists, librarians, and preservationists between Cuba and the United States. 3. Support of existing collection of Cuban scientific and scholarly journals and expanding the access to North American and European journals. 4. The support of an increased presence and participation of Cuban intellectuals, scholars, and scientists at international conferences such as LASA and the annual North American Chemical Congress. 5. To provide for the selection and support of a number of projects that are presently in progress. This activity will be fostered through partnerships with U.S. programs that have already established linkages with research centers and educational institutions, including the Northeast Document Conservation Center, the Smithsonian, the Center for Marine Conservation. The working group and the Academy will seek to make an inventory of existing programs with evaluation by Cuban counterparts. 6. And last, the organization of lectures and workshops in Cuba by distinguished scholars and scientists from the United States to be mutually determined by Cuban organizations and participating U.S. institutions. The working group and the Cuban Academy of Sciences will jointly determine the workshop topics. That was the golden age. That was the golden age of the 1990s. The program still exists on paper. If you visit the SSRC website, it's still there with a little caveat. Quote, there are currently no plans to hold another small grants competition. This is a program that obtained tremendous support from a host of foundations. The Barker Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Christopher Reynolds Foundation, the Barker Foundation. And it occurred within a specific historical, political context. This, in effect, was track 2 in the Clinton administration. In discharge of the legislative mandate contained in the People-to-People Project in the Torricelli Act, and subsequently reiterated in a number of ways in Helms-Burger. These were the post-Soviet Union years, the collapse of the socialist bloc, a time when expectations were running high and rampant that the next government to fall a socialist dominant program is going to be the government of the effective. Track 2, People to People, was designed to promote development of civil society, to promote contact between Cubans and North Americans as a means explicitly to increase discontent on the island, as a way to produce political change inside Cuba. Not to put too fine a point on this, to subvert the Cuban government. In Cuba, when we first arrived, and I was part of the first working with the Warren and standing the first series of meetings, not surprisingly, you can appreciate, this initiative was received with enormous skepticism and suspicion, and in some quarters, outright and undisguised hostility. It took some time. And I think what finally pushed this over the doable phase was that there were sufficient people on the U.S. side in whom the Cubans had some confidence in Cuba. PC means persona non grata. and in this sense was instrumental in the willingness of credibility of people who participated in this, including Stan Katz, who collaborated with ACS. In any case, what is fascinating about this is that it enjoys spectacular success. In the context of track 2, people to people, there was a sense that this really was going to be different. We who were party to it from the US side were allowed to have indulge moments of self-importance. Because there was this expectation that this collaboration I was working with was going to have some role, some part, however small, in promoting and facilitating normalization of relations. Why do we think this? Because in point of fact, this is one of the steps prior to the normalization of relations with Vietnam. Exactly the same format. There was a belief that by promoting exchange, power, interaction, movement of people, movement of supplies, newspapers, magazines, microfilm, is in this general environment, it had an enormously salutary effect in creating an environment, and contributing to the creation of an environment in which normalization of relations could be at least contemplated. At least contemplated. Cuba was in the 1990s. Cuba was very, very much in. It was hot. Americans were just totally infatuated and blazed with Cuba. When you talk about music, the activity was doing concerts. Los bambangos in the United States, Cubanismo, los muñequitos de matanza were playing sold out venues in the United States. Women with the social club was all the rage. Such things as Motorboat and Sailing magazine began writing articles about sailing in Cuban waters. This is not even Marvel now. Sailing in Cuban waters. The travel cable channel had several travel specials on Cuba. The Cigar Aficionado ran several major special issues, and the most recent one is another one of them. Right now. The Sunday New York Times Magazine dedicated pages to the delights of travel to Cuba. The publication of travel guides and tour books to Cuba developed fully into a growth industry. An astonishing number of travel books, such as like mushrooms, began to appear in bookshelves before the Barnes and Noble. Of course, all this is remarkable that people couldn't travel to Cuba. And despite this kind of reality, there's this churning and anticipation that travel is imminent. Just beyond the road. And a funny thing happened when there was a normalization. It never came. I wanted to back up a little further because I think one of the ironies of the interest in Cuba in the U.S. What makes Cuba interesting is the very thing that makes Cuba inaccessible. The Cuban Revolution. Again, I've pondered this for many years, thinking how the Cuban Revolution transforms, clearly not Cuba, of course, not only Cuba. You would take a look at the curricula of undergraduate institutions before 1959. One would be hard pressed to find any sustained listing of Latin American courses across the United States. Cuba puts Latin America on the map. Communism in Cuba puts Latin America on the headlines, and we know the Academy follows the headlines. And so the interest in Cuba begins to expand in the years after the triumph of the revolution, principally in political science, history, economics, anthropology, sociology, literature, all in the aggregate will become now more as Cuban studies and as practitioners who go by this God or name of Honolulu. The suspension of political relations between Cuba and the United States reduced radically the number of exchanges that have been in place. But it's also true that despite these restrictions, as Lena suggested, this is continuous. Really never, ever stop. In the decades that follow, it's a kind of cycle, a kind of movie, people back and forth, sometimes high points, many, many low points. The problem with working in Cuba is that it is so unpredictable. It is so unpredictable. And I say unpredictable from both sides. Anybody who's worked in Cuba at any length of time knows that some of the obstacles, some of the difficulties, some of the problems are sometimes just as deep and persistent inside Cuba as they are from the United States. On the Cuban side, access to research materials, access to travel, getting particularly to small provincial cities, small towns can be very difficult. The normal farmer reaches the students into Guantanamo, and he was pulled in immediately by me, and they got the access to the provincial archive in Guantanamo, and did all the paperwork, and did all the letters of introduction, all the documentation required, all filed with stamp signed from Havana. Somehow Havana had no influence in Guantanamo. Totally unpredictable, a wasted trip. $1,000, $1,500 to get from Miami, Havana, Seattle, Guantanamo, nothing. But nevertheless, the work of collaboration continues, and the interest in this kind of collaboration is remaining strong. The fruits of this labor, certainly the SSRC, ACLS working with Cuba, and mechanical sciences, while this program was in full swing, was remarkable. It produced publications, it produced books, it moved people back and forth. There were meetings in Washington, the working group sent scholars to Canada, to Europe to participate. It wasn't only moving people back and forth from Cuba to the United States, it was getting Cubans to visit the appropriate conferences and meetings of their specializations. If the meetings were in Canada, the meetings were in Europe. So this was a full-blown project. In the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, this program enjoyed great support, and in the anticipation that something was going to happen. It didn't happen. And slowly Cuba has begun to lose its cachet, its appeal, because the changes before the government didn't happen, because the expectations were not met. Slowly Cuba has kind of been receded to the background. There are programs, however, in Cuba. There are fluky, quirky exceptions that I wish had possessed some logic, but they don't. We invited a microbiologist to the University of North Carolina to work with our microbiology people. We had 3 people come and spend 6 months working to Chapel Hill microbiology. This is we're giving visas from the very government to accuse Cuba of being engaged in any biological warfare. We gave 3 microbiologists permission to come study microbiology in Chapel Hill. University of North Carolina, as well as Sarah Lawrence, American University, SUNY Oswego, listed 1 or 2, have full semester programs with the University of Atlanta. Lane mentioned the fact that we issued this 10-month minimum. Well,
weeks, please.
I'm sorry?
10 weeks.
10-week minimum programs. And that dealt the body blood to probably 98% of all the programs that existed in Cuba. So there's a moment where people just sort of stop and say, okay, let's go back to the drawing board, and all of a sudden, the full semester programs are beginning to proliferate. I am certain that as these full semester programs begin to proliferate to people who are in power, stay in power, the time is not too late, when these programs will also be canceled. There was 2 years ago, there was one, now there are 5, 6, or 7. And they are being expanded as quickly as the University of Havana. The line was long in U.S. institutions. Probably as the University of Havana is able to accommodate these requests. I think just to, and those who have more of an exchange here, my own sense is, and I tell this to my graduate students, for those of you who are thinking of working in Cuba, Cuba is not for everyone. It really isn't. When my students, graduate students, come to Chapel Hill, I have to talk with them, and they apply to come to do a campus visit, and I say to them, you really have to be aware of the obstacles, both the objective obstacles and the predictable obstacles associated with Cuba. Cuba is not like Mexico or Costa Rica. You land, get into your hotel, pick up your laptop, and march into the archivo and start working with total perfect comfort and reality. It doesn't work that way. The obstacles in Cuba, the bureaucratic hassles, the patronage system is very, very formidable. And so I tell my students, which I would pass on to interested parties, that people have to have three keys. They have to have patience. They have to have persistence. And most of all, really most of all, I mean, it's the total earnestness. You've got to have passion. Because if you don't have the passion to work on Cuban, you're not going to do it. It's the passion that strengthens morale and it enables resolve. And then after all that, you really got to have a sense of humor. So I have to answer my question.
The question is whether the panelists think that the current Bush administration policy towards scholarly exchanges in Cuba is something that had been planned before the administration entered office, or is a post 9/11 shift in policy.
The Bush administration.
Yes.
Yeah.
The current administration.
I'm sorry. Okay. Well, yeah, I think this was something that Bush came to office with. Look, Jeb Bush was governor of Florida. He was Ileana Ross's election campaign director. Ileana Ross is to the right of Genghis Khan. I mean, there's, she would like to invade Cuba tomorrow if that were at all possible. She and Diaz Lord and his brother Mario. So Jeb Bush worked for her and with her, feels exactly the same way. It was at this point that Orlando Bosch, the other arch terrorist, I should say the other architect of the bombing of Cuban flight in 1976 with a loss of 73 lives, he got back to the United States, came in without a visa, and the Justice Department was trying to deport him. But Jeb goes to his father, George H.W. Bush, then the president, and urges that he be allowed to remain in the United States. And he was. The Justice Department said this would do incredible damage to our whole position against terrorism, but it didn't matter. He stayed anyway. So the Bush boys grew up with this, this anti-Castro position. It's not post 9/11. Bush comes in, and as soon as the terrorist attacks took place on 9/11, the Cuban government expressed its solidarity with the American people, opened its airspace to any American planes trapped in the air when we closed ours, immediately offered full cooperation with the United States against any form of terrorism, and then signed all 12 UN resolutions against terrorism. The door was open, and I thought, wouldn't it be ironic if 9/11 at least resulted in something good? It brought about rapprochement between the United States and Cuba. But of course, Bush rebuffed all that. They paid no attention whatever to these offers to cooperate against terrorism in the wake of 9/11, and then they very quickly formed the Committee for Assistance to a Free Cuba, and Roger Noriega, who at one point worked for Senator Helms, and was at this point in 2003 the Assistant Secretary of State appointed by Bush, said that it is the objective of the President to bring down the Castro government and the entire apparatus that has supported it all through the years. So under Bush, it becomes nothing less than regime change. And I would say that was preordained. They came to office with that idea, with that objective, the idea of putting that forward, and it's still there. They are so bogged down in Iraq. I don't think they could possibly. It would have to be really insane. It would have to be further over the edge than they seem to be. To take military action against Cuba in view of what's going on in Iraq. But, let me say that Cuba has survived. They've survived everything we can throw at them. They've survived incredibly, survived the collapse of the Soviet Union, the special period that Lou was talking about. Incredible economic difficulties. They've come through all that. At this point, talking to a couple of Cuban government officials the last time I was down there in February, at this point, they almost see the United States, I don't say as irrelevant, but they have this relationship now with Chavez and with the Chinese and various other countries that are coming in. And listen, if that oil field off the North Coast comes in, U.S. policy is finished. It's absolutely finished. It's virtually finished anyway. So, the Bush administration came in with the idea that we were going to get rid of the Castro government. But how are we going to do that? The weapons they put forward are pathetic. We're going to increase radio and TV marquee broadcasting. Well, radio marquee's been broadcasting for more than 20 years. That's had the slightest impact on Cuban public opinion. TV marquee, we've been paying $16 million a year, and it's never seen or heard in Cuba. And now, even though we're spending even more money to transmit from airplanes, it still isn't seen or heard. And even if it were, it wouldn't have any more impact than radio marquee. So it's sad. And travel, cut back on travel. We're going to restrict Americans from traveling to Cuba. Well, that is a nuisance, to be sure. It does cut back somewhat on Cuban revenues, but tourism's still doing fine with Canadians and Europeans and Latin Americans, especially Venezuelans, traveling to Cuba. Tourism is doing fine. So that really is something of an inconvenience, but it certainly isn't going to bring the Cuban government down or force it to do anything. And then the other is increased support to dissidents on the island. Well, think about that. At a time when our government is saying its objective is to bring down the Castro government, they're saying one of their means of doing this is to give increased support to the dissidents on the island. That turns them into the agents of a foreign power, subversive agents of a foreign power trying to overthrow their own government. And they, please don't do that. I know Osvaldo Payá and Osvaldo Sanchez and Maduro and a whole series of others very well. I've known them for years. And they see this as sort of the kiss of death. It certainly does not help them. But increased support to the dissidents on the island. How much of that support do you think gets sent? That money goes to Miami, and groups in Miami are supposed to distribute it on the island. Virtually nothing gets in. This is a payoff to the Cubans in Miami. It's not increased support to the dissidents on the island at all. It doesn't have any impact, whatever. So U.S. policy is a total dud. We don't have any instruments to bring down the Castro government. We're simply left standing on the sidelines, mumbling to ourselves, while Cuba goes forward and has increased relations with many other countries. I'm going on too long, and I'll stop right now, give a little chance. But just before, it was July something, July the 14th, that Condoleezza Rice and Secretary of Commerce, what's his name, Gutierrez, came out with a statement, a new 90-page statement on Cuba, free from the Committee for Assistance to a Free Cuba. The purpose, the slightly changed purpose from the one that was issued in 2007, that was 500 pages. Teach them how to run the trains on time, that kind of thing. This one, principal purpose seemed to be to emphasize that the transition strategy was unacceptable. The idea that Raul Castro, the first vice president of the country, would replace his brother was simply intolerable. That couldn't happen. Well, a few days later, it did happen. And, people were dancing in the streets of Miami and thinking it was all over. And the interview with the guy, the Cuban American in Miami, he didn't know whether he should go back next week or wait 3 or 4 months and then go back and claim his property. Utter nonsense, pie in the sky. Now, 9 months later, Castro, I think, obviously is not going to resume the presidency. It seems most of them like that. He would resume the presidency, but Raul Castro is running the country. Cuba goes on, and the economy is steadily improving. It needs to go a long way, but steadily improving, and we're sort of left standing, as I say, on the sidelines, mumbling to ourselves.
A question back?
A brief comment. I'm not a historian, but it's my understanding that every president of the United States has at one point or another made claim to Cuba as American property or American destiny. But my question was this. I had the impression that one of the reasons, or maybe even the major reason for the government backing away from Track 2 was that almost overwhelmingly, almost everyone who went down to Cuba came back with a very positive attitude toward it. And in fact, it wasn't supporting dissidents down there, it was corrupting the American visitors.
That's exactly right. When people came back, and instead of being
Shall we state the questions?
in Cuba, they came back as agents that changed the policy. And it's really quite astonishing. they very quickly realized that not only were people coming back and following, but they're also using quite a bit of hard exchange to the Cuban economy. And the combination of both these factors was favorable.
My question is for both panelists, but I wanted to ask about Dr. Perez. We were talking earlier about how in the 1990s there was some expectations after the collapse of the Soviet Union, expectations of change in Cuba. There were some changes in the relations in tourism and music and culture. So my question is something that Dr. Smith started to talk about with the Castro's health in power to Raúl Castro. Is there some type of expectations now on these political changes with the Castro brothers in the power in Cuba? And how would that, if there's some expectation, something will affect U.S.-Cuban economic relations?
Is there expectations in Cuba, expectations in the United States?
In the relation, both ways. Probably more, here, but.
Let me restate the question in case people in the back can't hear, because the acoustics make it difficult for people in the back to hear questions. The question is whether the secession between Fidel and Raúl Castro, expectations that there'll be some government change or regime change in Cuba are likely to affect U.S.-Cuban scholarly relations.
I can't see that happening principally because of Hans Berkman. Hans Berkman is very explicit. Hans Berkman says there can be no longer, among long conditions that Cuba has to meet, it explicitly says there can be no change of policy to a normalization relations with Cuba as long as Raúl Castro or Raúl Castro are in power. So Hans Berkman has to be repeated.
Yeah. But it can be. No, it can be. And the most worrisome, I think, element in the present situation is that Raúl Castro, yes, he's been running the country for the past 9 months, he's been running broadly and so forth, but he's the president, but he isn't really the president, as long as Fidel is sitting over there in the wings. And Raúl Castro is, I would say, far more pragmatic than his brother. He doesn't have his brother's charisma. But the armed forces are the most efficient organization in the country. And because of his leadership and his managerial style, the armed forces have been deeply involved in tourism and various other enterprises. And they've been very good at it. They've made money, shown themselves to be good businessmen, and they want to continue that and broaden out. So Raúl Castro, I think, would lead the country toward a more flexible economy with probably greater infusions of private initiative. But that would be rather difficult to do as long as Fidel is sitting there in the wings, because he probably wouldn't approve of some of the steps that he's trying to take. Now, they're 75 and 80 years old, and they've been getting along and making compromises all their lives, and they can continue to do that. My only point is that how long can this go on? How long can Raúl Castro be the president, but not really be the president? It could become a real problem.
Lou, you spoke briefly about the challenges, shall we say, that research in Cuba poses for practically anyone, I think, and I was wondering what your impressions were in regard to possible changes in the situation of foreign researchers in Cuba after the dismantling of the programs you spoke about, SSRC, ACLS. You think it's just what is your impression in terms of the feasibility of attaining research visa? Because a number of formerly visa granting institutions are no longer doing so on the Cuban side.
The Cubans were, until a couple of years ago, turned a blind eye to people who reached Cuba right through the tourist visa to undertake research. It's illegal, but basically it was tolerant. It was one way to get a tourist visa from Manasur, go to Havana and work at the National Library. Not as easy in the National Archives, but easy in the library. Now they really crack down. Now, if you intend to do research in Cuba, you have to have a research visa, which means someone has to sponsor you. Someone has to pull you in. Someone has to be responsible for you. I think research in big cities is far more easy than in small towns. I think that library archival research is far more easy than fieldwork. Going around with a tape recorder or a clipboard and collecting data and statistics, then we're going to have a lot of support behind that project. And so there were gradations. As I said, I've had several students who went to Eastern Cuba to do research and they had a lot of problems. Great problems. You can get to Havana and comparatively few people know you're there. When you get to the city of Guantanamo, when you get to the town of Banis, okay, everybody knows you. Okay, and the first question is, what do you do here? Especially from America. And so those are the problems. And part of the suggestion with one of my students is that you never know what is needed. In other words, in terms of anticipating from past experience, kind of documentation, kind of letters of introduction, and you do it, and then 6 months later, that's it off. And something happens, and this responds to a logic that sometimes is inscrutable from the outside. And then you respond to that, and then 6 months after that, something else is there. So I said, the passion and patience, and I know it's difficult, clearly for graduate students who want to finish a dissertation in their lifetime, and for people who just latest stage in career is not as urgent as pressing for graduate students. It's very difficult to contemplate the possibility that you get to Cuba within the project, because then you can't get access to the material that you need.
I'm going to push this toward a more academic question. I really behind what you're saying, a vision of plurality of power or multiple sites of power in Cuba. Many people's image of an authoritarian system is that lines of authority are clear, that power is centralized. But what you're saying implies that power is multiple and decentralized in Cuba today?
It's part of that, and it's also part of the historic dynamic between East and West Cuba. There's an enormous amount of time between East and West. And so it's difficult to have mentally with the proper credentials and supporting material from Atlanta, and then you enter into a small town or a small provincial capital and expect that that's going to have the desired effect. It's totally the whims of whoever happens to be there. And the same student had gone to Guantanamo 2 years earlier, had no problem. No problem. So we figured out, we got this one down. Guantanamo was a great place to work with 21 times. And the second time around, he was just not welcome. And again, part of this is the climate that both countries operate in. Relations are worse, research possibilities just spiral down. And when they're good, not that they're ever good, but when they're better, then things relax.
Yeah, I'd just like to pick up on the comment here about sort of this expectation of change in Cuba in the United States. And we sort of hear from the religious community that we work with in Cuba that when the U.S. relations are less tense with Cuba, that political space opens up, at least for the churches, religious communities, to function more openly. Or I should say, there's more space to operate, there's more options. And I'm just wondering, do you think if the U.S. were to end the trade embargo, or what do you think, would that have any significant impact on political space opening in Cuba, or do you think it really won't make much difference?
You want to try? Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Look, the other side, the right-wingers down in Miami will always tell you, look, don't tell us that opening up to Cuba is going to have any effect on the political system there. You know, you don't bring about democracy by having people out on the beach. And after all, there have been Canadian and European tourists going to Cuba forever, and that hasn't brought about much change. Yeah, but Canada is not the Colossus of the North. I mean, we have been, the United States has been the principal threat to Cuban sovereignty and independence since at least 1898, if not before. So it's not what Canada does, it's what the United States does. So long as the United States is taking a threatening position, maintaining the embargo and all that, Cuba will react defensively. Now, you can't, I wouldn't go too far in the other direction. I don't think that if the United States lifts the embargo, Cuba will immediately hold elections and all that and move back to a fully democratic system. No. But, again, it could move away from this defensive posture that it's had for so long. The best thing that we can do would be to begin a dialogue, reduce tensions, begin a dialogue, and lift travel controls. That would start movement in the right direction, but we must exaggerate how far, how fast that movement would go. Coming from the religious community, don't you find it absolutely incredible that the Bush administration will not give licenses to the Cuban Council of Churches to come up? They say that they're too close to the government. Well, they have to follow the government's rules and so forth. But as far as the Bush administration is concerned, the State Department, that means that they're practically government officials. And last I heard, our National Council of Churches can't get a license to travel to Cuba for the same reason, because they would visit with the Cuban Council of Churches. What kind of nonsense is that? I mean, it's just irrational. I think we should be trying to have close relations between the churches on two sides of the Straits of Florida. The religious exchange is going back and forth, so it denied licenses to the Council of Churches. Well, it shows how far off the administration's position is.
Lou, you mentioned that you didn't have any problems bringing the microbiologists to North Carolina, and also the logic of that. I think that in some level it seems pretty clear, like the natural sciences are not involved in the contestation of meanings in the way that the social sciences and the humanities are. And thinking about that, I wanted to ask you if you feel that, bringing the whole question back to the academics, if there is, the difficulties clearly are common, but there are also disciplinary distinctions. Do you see a different kind of geography in terms of the potential, or the current conditions and potentials for this within different disciplines, being the natural sciences, humanities, or social sciences?
Let me restate this, please. Just the question is, given that you were able to bring a microbiologist to North Carolina, is it possible that certain disciplines, perhaps because they're less controversial than others, would have different visa policies applied? And what do you think the differences might be among disciplines in the likelihood of achieving academic exchange?
I would find it almost impossible to imagine that we would take from concerned about contested meetings. I think they would be more concerned about bringing 300 biologists from Cuba to work in a facility where they're designed to make weapons of mass destruction. What I'm suggesting is I'm trying, when these things happen, you have to be obvious. Macalester College gets a Cuban scholar visit every year, and some of the small programs. One searches for logic, okay? Why is it that Lindlanders came to Harvard last fall? The Cuban intellectual writer, essayist. None of them get a visa to come to Harvard, but he got a visa to teach at Harvard. He was a Robert F. Kennedy visiting professor. I said, how the hell did you do that? How does it? Well, it turns out that there's a convoluted lateral connection that goes to the Cuban desk officer that has connection to Harvard. Okay, that I understand. In our case, it was serendipitous. I don't know. We applied for 6 months. These programs did it, and the frustrating thing is that as hard as we try, you just can't discern the logic. Why this time and not last time? And so, because it seems to be so erratic, it's so capricious, we apply. We have a film festival every year. We invited the vice president of the kite to talk at Chapel Hill, and with plenty of time, all following all the regs, all the protocols. No. They just never answered. Okay? And of course, once the date of the invitation letter expires, it's still early. I invited a student from Cuban who was very familiar with the Americans, very familiar. And he was sure he was going to get the visa. He did an interview. He said the interview went very well. He said, so get the ticket. No, not so fast. Let's just see. And I invited him for the full. And I don't let him invite people anymore for a fixed time. I said, when you get the visa to come, we'll organize a program around at that moment. And he never heard. So I said, okay, I'll invite you for the spring semester. I said, another letter. Anytime between January 15th and May 5th, we will be more than happy to provide to receive you on notification of the visa, and we will be kick it to action organize a program and Secretary General. And he's stunned. And so I have no idea, what the make of this. Sometimes yes, most of the time no.
In the back.
Yes, I'm very honored to hear both Wayne and Lou. My name is Marilyn McKenna. I'm from the Chicago Religious Leadership Network on Latin America. And I just like to encourage people. I think Wayne is correct. It's unlikely that HR 654 is going to pass this year. But I think it's really important that we all work on it. Because these bills never pass easily. And the process of getting our representatives on the bills is an organizing process, it's an education process. Believe it or not, lots of people still don't know that they can't travel to Cuba, shockingly enough. So I just want to encourage, I have cards here that people can send to their representatives. And I really want to encourage us to take this from, studying the restrictions to ending the restrictions. And anybody from any part of the country can use these cards, but particularly if you're in Illinois, we have key districts that we're working on. And if you want to sign up to work with us closer, I'd love to get in touch with you. And thanks again for doing this program and raising this issue.
Did you have a question?
No, I'm sorry, that's a comment.
Oh, well, that's very good. I think that's what we need, people getting in touch with their congressmen, urging them to sign on to the Rango bill and any other bill, and we're easing up on Cuba. Thank you. Let me just make a comment here. we're talking about Helms-Burton, that we can't really move toward a normal relationship with Cuba so long as Helms-Burton is there. And that's absolutely true. One thing it says, as we was pointing out, is that we can't have normal relations with any government that includes either Fidel or Raul Castro, and a number of other things that would make it almost impossible to have a normal relationship with the Cuban government so long as Helms-Burton is there. And I was saying earlier that some of these bills, the Rangel bill for one, 106 sponsors now, but I have doubts that it will pass this year. Maybe it will, let's hope so, and we ought to all push for it. But I do have a sense that we're nearing the end. Polls indicate that the overwhelming majority of Americans think we ought to have a normal relationship with Cuba, but it's not something that affects their daily lives. So, it's not the issue that they're going to press above all others. But I think there is a growing sense in the United States that this policy doesn't work. And it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked for 48 years. We're supposed to be pragmatic people, and something hasn't worked for 48 years. Surely you ought to try something new, something else. And I really do have a sense that within the next couple of years, this whole thing is going to collapse, and especially if that oil field comes in. But even if it's looking promising, there's not another country in the world that supports our Cuban policy. The vote in the General Assembly every year is 187, 185 or so against U.S. policy, and so sometimes three votes for the United States, Israel, which always votes with us, but they're one of Cuba's major trading partners. They vote with us against embargo and then trade furiously, do what they want to. Very sensible of them to do. And then sometimes it's Palau, sometimes the Marshall Islands, John, wow, with partners like that, you can go far. But no one supports us. We're totally isolated. The policy is foolish. It doesn't work. And I think the American people are really getting to the point of saying, enough, for God's sakes, get rid of the Helms-Burton bill. It won't happen this year, probably not next, but I do think it's coming. And at that point, then we can, at long last, have normal relations with Cuba.
Oh, before that, I don't share Lenny's optimism of the oil. I fear that they find oil. If they find oil, there'll be a pretext for invasion. That's my fear. I hope they will find oil. The oil projection of oil that they're talking about is large. It's imagining. It's not easy. It's not difficult to create a pretext for invasion.
Do you feel there's a need for political change in Cuba, or?
I'm sorry, what?
I'm sorry, do you feel there's a need for political change in Cuba, or think the system is okay the way it is, and the only problem is our relationship?
Well, no, look, I think we'd all like to see Cuba move in the direction of a more open society, greater respect for civil rights of people and so forth. But you're not going to bring that about through the present policy, as I say. The more threatening and aggressive the posture the U.S. takes, the more defensive will be the reaction of the Cuban government, taking exactly the wrong direction. Cuban dissidents like Elisardo Osvaldo Payá have been saying for years they would like to see the United States begin a dialogue with the Cuban government, move towards a more normal situation. So yeah, we're going to change, but I'm not one of those who thinks that they must have democratic elections sort of supervised by the United States in order to qualify. But toward a more open society, and with greater respect for the civil rights of the Cuban people. And keep the free healthcare if they can.
I'd like to ask the panelists to clarify something, a question I'm often asked about the embargo on Cuba. Almost all of the societies of the Caribbean basin get remittances from people who live abroad in the United States or in England and Canada. And when I speak to people about the embargo in the United States, they sometimes assume that the tightening of the embargo is intended to be a restriction on remittances of family members to relatives in Cuba. Do you think that the current shifts in policy regarding academic exchange are simply in the wake of an attempt to cut down on remittances, or do you think that these issues are unlinked?
I think my sense is that the restriction of travel in all forms has as one of its purpose the reduction of hard currency to Cuba. I'm not sure that academic exchange is in single out of the sense that the academics in particular much in the Cuban economy. But I think it is included in a larger category of cutting down on exchanges. And I don't think anybody who has family in Cuba who lives in Florida will allow the legal restrictions against remittances to stop them from sending money. The last I heard, the estimated remittances from the United States to Cuba is like $1 billion a year. It's not stopping.
If you want to keep hard currency out of Cuba, keep those academics out. They're known to get extinguished.
Last question?
Yeah.
It seems to me that I'm an academic, and so I'm very interested, and let me premise this by saying I agree with everything that you're saying in terms of trying to change the restrictions that have been imposed. But it seems very self-interested for us to say that we, as academics, should be able to travel to Cuba, but nobody else. Like that, it seems consistent that we should be not able to travel as much as anybody else can, and it seems consistent that the Bush administration is doing this. I'm not surprised the restrictions are growing at all. And so what I'm wondering, and when I read the popular press and when I talk to people who are not in academia, or those who may be undergraduates who want to go to Cuba on exchanges and so forth, that there's a lack of solidarity of people who have interest in going to Cuba in different capacities. And you have groups that are cultural groups that are working against the embargo. You have little academic pockets. You have Cubans that want to go back to Cuba. And we're all very interested in our own reasons for going there. And the hub of the problem is, of course, the policy. So instead of fighting, or maybe not instead of, but in addition to fighting for these things that we all want to keep open, there needs to be a broader mobilization against the policy. Whether that be the Helms burden, if that's, I'm not a lawyer, I don't know, if that's the seed, the underlying seed of the issue, that would, if that broke open, if everything else would then follow, whatever it is, the mobilization, and from what my experience in this is that it has to be broader, it has to be louder, so that the people who aren't affected by the restrictions on a daily basis have some consciousness of it, so that they learn. Whether that means 100 social scientists march on the White House or whatever it is, but it has to be something that gets into mass media and is bigger, and or at least is bigger in terms of visuality. Because an academic discussion and us working towards this, and Costa, there's this other student that happened in Florida, there's these little pockets of things happening, but nobody knows about it and nothing is moving forward as a result. So I wonder what you think about that. And if you think that's a possibility, or if that's maybe too utopian.
Well, what's a possibility?
I'm sorry, was that audible in the back? Could you hear? Yeah.
What's a possibility?
Mobilizing on a grander scale and making it more accessible to people who are not in academia.
I think it is. I think that we should defend academic freedoms also. Look, I don't think any of us who are involved in this are just concentrating on academic freedoms or on, lifting travel controls on academics. We all support the Wrangle bill. would like to see travel controls lifted altogether. A whole series of other measures that are out there that I think we should support. I don't think, I'm interested to hear what Lou has to say, I don't think at this point you could mobilize a lot of support for lifting the embargo and normalizing relations with Cuba. I hope that comes within the next few years. But there are these other measures, Cuban-American travel, various other things that I think we should push forward, but with the idea that this is just sort of the beginning. These are some small steps leading towards something much bigger. And in that sense, I would agree with you.
I would first just want to say that you're getting right to exchange and that thing, because that's what we're asked to address, right? That doesn't mean that other travel should not be encouraged. But I hasten to add, in a sense, and you can feel it in between the lines of our discussion today, that once the travel ban is lifted and everyone can travel to Cuba, I would underscore that the Cuban government determines who gets to Cuba. Not the American government gets the travel ban. The Cubans control who gets to the country, into the country. And insofar as, I have, from time to time, bouncing insomnia, I think of Cuba as a spring break. It's chilling. It's chilling. And I've had these conversations with people in Cuba saying, how do you potentially see 750,000 million tourists in the United States? What kind of desolating effect could that have? A dollar of tourism in an aggressive economy. And they are very concerned about this. The idea that the travel ban gets lifted and everything's fine is not a provable premise, right? Because once the travel ban is lifted, the Cubans may still say, okay, we're only going to have 100,000 people a year. That's it. That's all. That's all we can handle. But I'm saying this idea that we have this belief that, once it's not question, once the travel ban is lifted, then everybody will be Cuba. And I'm not sure that's certain. The people in Cuba are very much concerned and very conscious of the implications of new tourists, new coming in, and then having undergraduates vacation there, having to go.
I'm talking about American policy and not saying that everybody's I'm talking about the problem on this side.
No, I agree. I think, I certainly would not say, only you can travel when you're not traveling to Cuba. Everyone who wishes to travel to Cuba should be able to travel to Cuba, or at least take a place on line to travel to Cuba.
Let me close the discussion now, unless you had a comment that's absolutely essential to follow up on this.
To be pretentious on my part, I think so. I really wanted to add to our comment. It's just that the FIU poll about Cuban Americans just released last month showed that more than 60% of Miami Cuban Americans support the lifting of all restrictions to travel to Cuba. So it's just saying that if that broad movement is to happen, the importance of bringing Cuban Americans who have a vested interest in going to Cuba, involved, and especially not resist the temptation of demonizing them as the Miami Cubans.
If I could just ask you, do you know of that 60%, how many of that 60% are U.S. citizens?
Of the whole poll, I think, they have not for this specific question, but they do have the numbers for the
conventional wisdom is there's a direct correlation between the number of people who want to travel to Cuba and the ones who are here the most recent. Okay, people who can go along this with no connections, no ties.
Yeah, but the number keeps growing.
Yeah,
people who are arriving and people who are at earlier events.
Let me stop the discussion now temporarily. We'll have a coffee break and reconvene at 5:30 for a panel that will focus very much on doing research in Cuba, on existing scholarly exchanges. But I want you to ask you to please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists who've traveled to